This old house, more than 100 years have come and gone. This old house stands so frail and yet stands so strong. Its history is a blessing. Its history is so long, so rich, so brave. Its history is a song. Now sing its works with gratitude. Sing the stories of its past. Sing the history of dear Wellington. Sing it loud so it will last. And pray the words will fly with its message on their wings to carry lessons of its good work and make sure its words will sing.
There is incredible heart energy in this sanctuary, and it is something that has been built up over almost 110 years of people bringing their best selves, bringing their worst selves, bringing their joy, their grief, their longing for community, their hunger for justice, their social activism and commitment. People have been bringing their full selves to this space for so long that you can feel it.
Its beauty is like poetry. Its dimensions call for prayer. The craftsmanship in hand-carved oak, the tapestried benches now threadbare, the basilica with its cross of gold, the barrel-vaulted arch, the stained glass windows rich with flowers, processionals of every kind of march, of marriages, of baptisms, and laying folks to rest. The sacred space embraced it all. The sacred space is blessed.
The beauty of this church and the sanctuary has always struck me. There's both a simplicity to the way this church was built, but also a kind of poetry in form and material that I think is just amazing. The architect was Norman Patton and was well known right at the turn of the early part of the 20th century. The two separate entrances of the church were meant to symbolize the joining and merger of the two congregations that came together, the Lincoln Park Church with Evanston Avenue Congregational Church in 1909 to form Wellington. The cornerstone of the building was laid in November 1910. The sermon for that inaugural message was titled "The Church as a Community Center." The spaces of the church, designed by our architect, were meant for community involvement, spaces for our ministries to work, to show our faith in action. Being able to draw on the historic movements like the civil rights movement that Wellington was so active in, all the way back to our first pastor, Edward Williams, who, as a young theologian, taught Black Union soldiers, Black regiments from the Civil War on the banks of the Potomac River. Edward Williams connects us to the founding of Howard University, the abolitionists who, as clergy, went to ask Abraham Lincoln, petitioned to write the Emancipation Proclamation, and after the Civil War, worked with Blacks in forming educational institutions. That kind of connection to truth and justice carried him to the Dakotas, where he was an agent to make sure that the government treaties with the groups like the Lakota were being served justly. And right next to him is Lily McDonald Merrill. Early on, we had a woman pastor who worked originally at Hull House with Jane Addams. That's another person who's rooted in Wellington history. Now, those are the two that have rooted for me what this church is about.
From its very inception, Wellington Avenue United Church of Christ was dedicated to peace and justice. At the birth of the new century, it provided a haven to serve the whole community. In 1916, 5 years after the building of the church, Wellington opened its doors to the first Finnish Congregational Church and hosted Thanksgiving services with Lakeview churches and synagogues. The following year, at the height of America's involvement in World War I, the newly formed Women's Guild became a Red Cross auxiliary and made thousands of hospital garments for wounded soldiers, and would later help traumatized veterans returning home from war. Wellington also became a true community center, with the gym being used every day and plays being performed every Sunday night. In 1922, after 40 years of service dating back to even before Wellington's formation, Sunday school superintendent Willis Baird retired, and a celebration of his work was held. Eventually, the church's social space would be named in his honor. The church's outreach to other communities grew as well. In 1923, the Women's Board began to study Black literature, music, and art. Speakers on Turkey and Armenia visited the church in 1926 and lectured about war and famine. In 1927, young people from Wellington learned about the living and working conditions of poverty-stricken families at Jane Addams Hull House. Through this critical period of Wellington's growth, Pastor George Mills consistently preached on social issues to the congregation. He led Wellington in the fight against pollution from coal plants, cynically placed in marginalized neighborhoods, and planted the seeds of environmental justice with the Black Skies campaign. A 1926 sermon demanded that our city must divest itself of religious bigotry, social distrust, and class hatred if we are to save America. In response to the profound levels of poverty and discrimination, the Women's Guild organized the Lakeview Clothing Distribution Center at the Lincoln Belmont YMCA. At Wellington, the congregation distributed winter clothing, boxes of food, and raised money for flannel jackets for hospitalized children. Youth sent care packages to children in China, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Recognizing the need for a community response, Pastor T. Rutledge Beale organized 32 interfaith and secular institutions into the Lakeview Council of Religious Action. Easter 1934 brought a message of hope from the pulpit. Pastor Thomas Anderson declared to the congregation, "We have passed through the Depression at its worst. We have more than held our place. We have moved forward." After the New England Congregational Church burned to the ground in 1936, it entrusted Wellington with its most precious possession, the Scrooby baptismal font. Originally built in the 14th century in England, the Scrooby font arrived at the New England Congregational Church in 1881. Wellington became its permanent home in 1942, and for decades, babies were baptized, named, blessed, and welcomed into the fold of the beloved kingdom. The font held its place of honor in the apse, a touchstone reminding us of the history of God's work in the world. The 1940s brought a Second World War. In response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor on February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed into action Executive Order 9066. Tens of thousands of Japanese Americans were stripped of their livelihoods and property, uprooted from their communities, and interned in isolated, desolate camps. Across the country, anti-Japanese sentiment was virulent. 2 years later, young Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during the war were welcomed into the congregation, and a Japanese missionary who had been imprisoned spoke at the church in 1943. During that time, Wellington's youth responded by sending cards and gifts to Japanese young people imprisoned in the camps. In May of 1944, almost 200 members of the congregation signed the World Order Compact, a document pledging to end war and work towards a world of peace. 18 months later, the war ended, at an unimaginable cost. Two atomic bombs took the lives of hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. Rather than ushering in an era of world peace, the atomic age was born. The end of the war soon gave way to a new kind of fear. The Cold War brought the Red Scare, widespread suspicion of communist activity, and the shame of McCarthyism. Despite this climate that created a chilling effect on progressive activities around the country, Wellington continued to live its faith in action. As with veterans returning home from the First World War, the women of Wellington again worked to welcome traumatized servicemen back into society, long before the recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder.
When I was doing the archives, I felt so proud of the women of Wellington. They saw the need and they stepped in.
They were very clear that prayer and personal devotion was never enough to follow the way of Jesus.
The church was still active in the community, partnering with 7 other congregations to form the Lakeview Associated Ministry of Protestants in 1954. Meals were served to neighborhood children on Saturday mornings. Wellington elected the first woman as the church council moderator in 1956, and the Women's Guild continued its outreach around the world by organizing, assembling, and shipping clothing and hospital dressings for the American Cancer Society. But as the 1950s drew to a close, the church, the city, and the country were about to experience a seismic shift. The nation reeled from the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. Within 2 years, Congress had granted President Lyndon Johnson broad powers to drastically escalate the Vietnam War. Domestically, the civil rights movement was gaining attention. In 1962, Wellington joined the North Side Cooperative Ministry, a group of 8 Protestant churches that focused on organizing against the Vietnam War and fighting racism in housing, education, and medical care. Wellington nurtured its relationship with the Lincoln Memorial Congregation, an African American church. Members took part in civil rights marches with Martin Luther King in Selma, and again when he came to Chicago. In addition to these new calls to action, the church continued the work it had long been doing. Reverend James L. Kidd was named pastor in 1961, and Wellington became a United Church of Christ. Associate Pastor Tom Henry impressed on the congregation the importance of lay leadership, and Reverend Kidd responded by reaching out to Elaine Clemon.
I didn't think anything of it, but it turned out that I was the first lay liturgist. But nobody seemed to be concerned or bothered, and everybody considered that to be just perfectly fine.
Soon thereafter, Elaine Clemon was part of an historic dialogue sermon with Father Carl Lezak, a Roman Catholic priest from a nearby parish, and a new era of lay women leadership at Wellington began. Molly Williams was named as the first woman to chair the church council. The Women's Guild continued to provide aid to indigenous communities, migrant workers, and patients in Cook County Hospital, among others. Herbie Hernandez became sexton, and a Spanish-speaking congregation began services at Wellington. Community theater continued, and a youth ministry was created. Jazz, folk, and gospel music were introduced into the liturgy. Society continued to be in a state of unrest, which was brought to a head in the summer of 1968. The nation again gasped in disbelief at the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. When the Democratic National Convention met in Chicago later that summer, demonstrators were met with violence by the Chicago police. In a show of solidarity with the protesters, Wellington provided sanctuary for them during the convention. The church from its beginning had always been concerned with social justice. The 1960s saw that concern deepen into more concrete action while laying the groundwork for decades of prophetic activism to come.
Now go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honor all people. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit.
David Chevrier was pastor at a church in Saxtons River, Vermont in 1969, when he and his wife Eloise first heard about Wellington from a friend based at the Chicago Theological Seminary.
We first came to Wellington in 1970. At the first church council meeting, they handed him the gavel because they were used to the minister leading the meeting. And he took the gavel and shoved it right back to the center of the table and said, "No, you are the church. This is your council and you lead the council." And I think that set a whole tone of lay leadership at Wellington.
Every Sunday was like a learning opportunity when he's so well read. He quoted Freud, he quoted Rilke, he quoted all the great theologians.
He had the capacity to quote Aeschylus, John Updike, and Martin Buber in the same paragraph and make it work.
Maintained a prophetic tradition rooted in a spirituality that demanded action.
The way Dave Chevrier would say, honor all people, it just had such depth and gravity. It seemed to wrap around together all the concerns that Wellington has had for the homeless, for the immigrant, for the poor, for the down and out.
He encouraged people to follow the way, to do the best that we could do as an individual and as a congregation.
It was just before Christmas and they were having the Christmas bazaar, and I went in and the church was all this dark wood and greenery, and Eloise Chevrier was singing. I thought it was an angel singing, and it just was so warm, welcoming, with this beautiful music.
Eloise Chevrier, oh my goodness, what would we have done without her? Eloise taught so many of the children in church. She taught so many of us in the church.
For many years, my children were part of the wonderful Sunday school with Eloise and Pat Dalkey.
I had done some church school teaching at our old church, but nothing like we ended up doing at Wellington. You couldn't find a curriculum. It's hard to find a curriculum that really fit who we were.
Their curriculum, they developed it themselves. Their curriculum, what to do in the event of a nuclear war, and you're there and you're without your family. They were talking to the children about all these issues.
Eloise reached out to a friend of hers that was a psychiatrist and went over our curriculum so that we wouldn't say anything that would somehow upset the kids. What we did do is we reassured the children that the adults were working very hard to prevent this from happening. And bless her heart, Eloise began to create curriculum. And she did it in a way that reflected what the adults at church were doing.
Such a delightful person, a lovely voice.
She just sang with all her heart every time she sang, and her soul comes out when she's singing.
The songbird and spirit of Wellington Avenue Church.
Reverend Michael McConnell arrived at Wellington in 1971 looking for work.
Michael was a very special person in David's life and in my life. He came to Wellington under interesting circumstances where he was looking for a tent maker's position.
this tent-making ministry, that we could go to seminary, we could be ordained by the church, but we could be called into ministries in the city, but still come back to the anchor of Wellington. We have chaplains in hospitals, we have chaplains at universities, people doing immigration law.
And when he offered this to some churches, they didn't understand this and didn't accept it. But when he talked with David about it, David said, "Oh my gosh, yes, we'll take you." And they were bonded brothers in the faith after that.
His presence was soon made clear as he leapt into his role as tent maker and felt called to protest the Vietnam War. Heavy on his heart was the idea of his tax money supporting the war that he and many others at Wellington adamantly opposed. Thus they began withholding telephone taxes that were being used to fund the military. Reverend McConnell was instrumental in organizing a busload of congregants from Wellington to Washington, D.C. in 1972 to protest the draft.
Michael was a comrade. That his work with David Chevrier and Sid Moan and others, to Elaine Clement, to deepen the historic commitment of Wellington. Michael, in many ways, helped form the Wellington that I knew.
He was crucial in leading the congregation to find their spiritual voices in nature. They began organizing weekend retreats at Tower Hill, filled with prayer, poetry, art, song, and just plain fun.
It was powerful to be just a community and not just go to church. We had Tower Hill, and we went to the park for picnics. And how we incorporated everybody. It's not like, oh, you're under 18, so we don't care. We brought everyone to the table.
That's why I danced and sang, and I had a good time at Wellington. I'm gonna tell you, I ain't never joined the church before in my life, but I had a good 10 years there, and it was great. I'm gonna tell you, I had fun. Everybody was friendly and loving.
The church also joined two critical institutions, the Alliance to End Repression, an organization dedicated to ending police brutality and surveillance, reforming prison conditions, and advancing the rights of the LGBTQ community, and CALC, Clergy and Laity Concerned, dedicated to protesting the war in Vietnam. In 1975, Steve Goodman performed a concert in support of CALC.
Nancy Pruder and I got to know each other, and somehow it came up about doing something for Wellington, a concert. I wanted to know how to get enough people together, but we needed a name, somebody that's good. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you know Steve Goodman?" "Oh yeah, I know his music. I'm going to get married to him." Wow. That blew my thing. Well, anyways, it wound up by doing 4 shows at the Earl of Old Town. The joy of having 2 churches get together and do something that made so many people happy, that's right here.
Wellington hosted Jane Fonda, who also spoke out against the war. Other issues were important to Wellington's mission. Church members sent letters of protest to Governor Ogilvy after years of racial violence against black citizens of Cairo, Illinois. The church participated in a boycott of lettuce and grapes in support of the United Farm Workers, fighting for fair wages and livable housing. The church building continued to be a center for community activity. Wellington staged its own production of Godspell, as well as an annual Christmas pageant, and welcomed other community theater groups. In January 1973, the church began sharing space with the LGBTQ Good Shepherd Parish of the Metropolitan Church of Chicago, to the disdain of both society and many church hierarchies.
Dave Chevrier contacted me he suggested that I consider joining Wellington and exploring ordination through the United Church of Christ.
Wellington called an openly gay person to congregational ministry, taking a bold risk in the mid-1970s.
When Wellington said, "We invite you," that overwhelming sense of grace was like walking from darkness into light.
At the time of his ordination, Reverend Sid Moan was only the second openly gay minister in the United States. Reverend David Chevrier began his ministry by welcoming tent makers and by challenging the congregation to live on less and give more. The church made a covenant to give 30% of their pledged income to the oppressed. They supported refugees, served in soup kitchens, protested the apartheid system in South Africa, founded a blood bank, and challenged the leadership of the UCC to increase donations to the oppressed in the Third World. The 1970s rejoiced in new leaders, new members, and a deeper commitment to the gospel's call for social and racial justice. Tent makers brought Wellington's mission into the city and the world, and the church strengthened its focus on aid to the poor and ending war. At the ripe old age of 70, Wellington intensified its progressive and maverick ministry.
Sanctuary is where life is precious, is guarded. It's a place where life is sacred and safe. In 1982, when the U.S. wars against the poor in Central America were raging, thousands of refugees were fleeing to the United States.
When the whole sanctuary conversation came up, we started hearing reports from a sister church down in Tucson that people were arriving to their church with bullet holes in them, fleeing unbelievable violence and desperation.
Hundreds of refugees found sanctuary at the Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona. That church's action catalyzed the Chicago Religious Task Force in El Salvador, and they asked Reverend Dan Dale to find other congregations to declare themselves a sanctuary as well.
Wellington was on my short list of 5 congregations because of its history as one of the places that lived its faith in action, and that if I challenged them to risk breaking an unjust law, that they might be willing to do it.
So the word got up to us, and so we started looking at what could we do to help that.
It was not an instantaneous yes from the congregation, because of course there were practical issues to consider, the possibility of our minister being arrested.
And so it was really a very heartfelt and deep theological reflection. What will we risk to be faithful? Do we really believe the gospel?
There were voices within the congregation that were saying, we've already done our part. Why do we have to engage around every new justice issue? And there were other voices that were saying, this is a new point of witness in which the church needs to express a prophetic voice.
After careful discernment, prayer, and reflection, Wellington said yes.
We initially, a Salvadoran family, the Guevara family, who lived within our church so that they could be safe from the violence that was threatening their lives in El Salvador.
They occupied an apartment on the third floor in the gym, and were afraid for quite a long time to come out.
It was emotional, wasn't it? You know, here are these real people who've been through Lord knows what, horrible things.
They did come down to speak to the congregation several times with masks on, so they could not be identified.
In Central America, we were using death squads. If a refugee told the truth about what had happened to them and their village and their family, the U.S.-supported death squads would assassinate their family members still in El Salvador.
I also heard a story when Reverend Sid Moan did the first worship service when the family was present, and it was a communion service. As they were preparing the table and going through the words for communion, he took a vase full of wine and poured it into the chalice, talking about the refugees, the fears, the violence that disappeared, the murder, and the wine kept flowing over the chalice onto the table and the floor to remind us that these are serious matters. Blood has been shed. And that's why we need to gather as community around that table to be support for one another.
We were at the forefront of building the sanctuary movement, and we believe deeply in the fact that the church should be a sanctuary for people in need and for people fleeing.
I credit Wellington a lot for sort of being on the front lines of that movement and teaching so many of us, this is how you do faithful resistance in the world.
If you present a congregation with a challenge to be faithful in which they have to risk something, this is something that comfortable, privileged North American Christians almost never have to do. And Wellington chose to do so, and with that prophetic example, over 500 congregations said yes.
Meanwhile, the role of the tent maker at Wellington continued to expand. James Harper, born in the poorest section of Chicago's West Side, was an alcoholic by the age of 12 and often homeless. A chance meeting with Wellington member Ann Brinks, whom he later married and had 3 children, brought him into the congregation. James challenged the Wellington congregation to keep working within their own neighborhood. James created Save the Alcoholic, which later became the Center for Street People, an organization devoted to welcoming the homeless, providing them counseling, food, and clothing. It was a ministry to which he devoted the rest of his life. For those who knew him best, like longtime friends and supporters Dick and Reverend Nan Conser, he was called a bridge. His wife Ann would write of him, "James dreamed of a community caring for each other, where you are loved and cared for by God." He took what could have been a wretched life, caught in the circumstances of birth and environment, and lived out a life filled with integrity, concern, purpose, and accomplishment. His work was cut short, however, when he was diagnosed with cancer. On May 7, 1983, Surrounded by family and friends in the hospital chapel, he was ordained and affirmed by the United Church of Christ. 1 week later, the Reverend James Harper passed away. After his death, an inscription was placed in the center that he founded. It read, "He comes to us where we live, and he loves us where we are." When artist John Volkening began attending the church in 1980, he had a vision for what services could look like, not with ornate decorations or luxurious displays, but with profound works of art. John's installations added depth, intensity, and meaning to the sanctuary, and he was named Wellington's first minister of liturgical arts. Among his most beloved works was a cross made of cracked mirrors.
I really wanted something that would reflect the congregation, that would reflect light, that would show that being cracked, as we all are in some kind of way, is a really beautiful thing, and that we're all reflected in that resurrection light. And it really represented those who were broken by the world. Not many churches are willing to go that deep, but Wellington could.
Wellington's acknowledgement that we are all cracked and broken, but reflected in the resurrection light, was exemplified when the church co-founded the night ministry for runaway teenagers. Church members were trained to handle and distribute sterile syringes and needles, condoms and food, and volunteers met teens on the streets where they slept. In addition, the congregation made a decision to offer its fellowship hall as a homeless shelter. For 7 nights a week over 2 years, church members laid out beds, cooked and served both dinner and breakfast, and supplied bathrooms and showers for dozens of people. Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the threat of a nuclear war had loomed over the entire planet. In the decades after the war, Russia and the United States built more and more weapons, edging ever closer to the possibility of mutually assured destruction. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, armed warheads were ubiquitous, placed in towns and cities, near shopping malls, parks, and schools.
Going back to the nuclear age, I mean, this was a time when Dick Simpson hung a big sign out in front of Wellington Church, nuclear-free zone, and we were talking a lot about how the scientific clock was pointing more and more towards 12.
Lakeview had actually been the center for a Nike site with nuclear weapons, or at least a Nike site to blow down any missiles that were headed to Chicago. There were demonstrations at the Nike site there at the Belmont Harbor. That didn't get removed until the 70s. That may seem like an odd thing now, but back then, Chicago was one of the epicenters of where a nuclear attack would be.
When I was in the circle, the communion circle around our table, at Wellington, it hit me one day. This is where I want to be if there's a nuclear attack. I want to be with these people in this place, joining hands in communion.
The church's involvement in the anti-nuclear movement went far beyond the neighborhood. In 1984, the youth group adapted and performed Dr. Seuss's Butter Battle.
There are two groups that are at odds with each other, the ones that butter their bread butter side up and ones that butter it butter side down. The differences in their beliefs about how you should butter your bread come to the point where it could turn into war.
Complicating matters was the fact that Dr. Seuss's estate did not want Wellington to use the material without receiving compensation. As it frequently did, the church turned to longtime member Earl Talbot, a lawyer in the congregation who provided decades of counsel.
One thing I learned in the legal business was it's easier to get forgiveness than to get permission. So you don't ask, you do it, and what are they going to do to you?
And we took it to the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco. And we carried all those crazy props around that were made out of paper towel holders and cardboard boxes and all those recycled materials. And somehow they made it all the way to San Francisco from Chicago because they were pieced together so delicately. But it was really special.
It wasn't just a play, but it was a message behind that play, which was really important. And we all knew that message.
It was an incredible adventure and statement of peace.
By the end of the 80s, Wellington, by all measures, had fulfilled its mission of peace and justice. The congregation was not done, however. Once again, as the old Union song reminds us, the rising of the women means the rising of us all.
It began with a lesbian couple going to see David and sitting down and saying to him, we can't sing these hymns. The hymns all say him for God, and that's not who we are. We're she, we're female, we're her. And so hymns were changed.
Before we sang a hymn, we would take our pencils and our pens and cross out the masculine terms and write in the terms that were inclusive. We either made God gender neutral or alternated he and she for the divine, which was quite radical.
Well, that's sort of the beauty of Wellington, right? I mean, I think it's so accepting of ideas, it's like, oh, okay, we'll do that then. That sounds great.
I do like to think about how Dave Chevrier addressed the AIDS crisis in the city in the 80s, which was not treated at all by our government. And the leaders in the city or the nation in the 80s, members of our church were dying too. And every Sunday, there was a call to action.
It made me realize that this is what church should be about.
One of my favorite communion memories, it's when the altar was up in the chancel area. People had to walk up to gather around the communion table. And we had a man who used to come here, his name was Ron. And it was back in the 80s, and he had AIDS. And he sorry. He had to be helped up the stairs by two people. And he would come up, and the congregation made sure that he drank out of the cup first, because we didn't want to give him anything. Instead of being afraid of him, we were afraid that we would make him sick.
Communion connects me to each other in the room, you know, when we stand up and we're actually able to be together and just are in a circle passing the bread and the wine and the juice.
It's a community. When you need a hand, there it is. Why? It's a family. We're part of a family. And that to me that's the church.
I think the most important thing was we all prayed together. We all sang together. We all hugged together. We all ate together. Everything was together. Nobody was an outsider. Everybody was included. It was just a together place to be in the house of God.
As when they welcomed the Good Shepherd Parish in 1973, the church continued to open its doors to the LGBTQ community. Throughout the 1980s, AIDS was rampant, and the rest of society turned a blind eye. ACT UP, a group of AIDS activists, were drawn to Wellington's commitment to being open and affirming, and there they found a safe place to organize protests. The church was among the first religious organizations to participate in Chicago's Gay Pride Parade, and Wellington members have marched every year since. In 1993, Wellington made a covenant with Reverend Sid Moan and with Reverend Craig Mooson, who was one of the church's leading voices in welcoming refugees and undocumented asylum seekers.
Kauleza is a South African song. It comes from the townships, locations, reservations, whichever, near the cities of South Africa, where all the black South Africans live. The children shout from the streets as they see police cars coming to raid their homes for one thing or another. They say, "Kauleza, mama," which simply means, "Hurry, mama, please. Please don't let them catch you." Kauleza, mama, kauleza, mama, kauleza, mama.
Probably one of the most important parts of my life here at Wellington was my involvement in the anti-apartheid movement.
When the church was protesting against the First National Bank selling the South African Cougaram, and it was like, how crazy is that the church, is going to not want a bank to sell Cougaram? What's the difference? And they went out there and they protested. I thought there's never going to be a chance that they're going to be successful.
And I just remember pushing the baby stroller with my child in it in front of the First National Bank of Chicago, shouting, "First National Bank out of South Africa."
And lo and behold, First National Bank said, "We're going to stop selling Cougaram." So it was like, when you look back, it was, wow, that was a pretty impressive thing that a little group did.
Betty Benson just devoted her life to justice. And, was out there, rain, winter, summer, fall, in front of the South African embassy with her silent vigil, saying, "Wrong, apartheid wrong."
In addition to protesting the investment of First National Bank in the apartheid government's gold, the congregation also questioned the United Church of Christ's own role in funding apartheid. Wellington requested a financial officer from the National UCC to clarify the church's position on investments in South African Cougarams. The UCC officer initially justified the investment on behalf of the denomination.
The UCC was investing in gold for the regime, supporting it, and here we were being hypocrites.
After years of advocacy by Reverend David Chevrier, Reverend Fred Trost, and others, the National UCC decided to divest.
Collins Ramusi, who was on the death list by the South African government because he was part of the ANC, he came to Wellington because he knew of our work in the anti-apartheid movement.
He would pray and urge us, pray without ceasing to end apartheid in South Africa.
6 years after Collins Ramusi's initial visit to Wellington, his wife Esther came with a delegation of women from South Africa.
And when they came into our sanctuary, they were wearing the most outstandingly beautiful outfits. It made us all tear up because it was just so beautiful and so powerful.
I don't think I have ever been as moved by music in my life as I was by that South African choir. You could just hear the centuries of oppression that they had lived under, but their kind of indomitable spirit.
In the early 1990s, Collins Ramusi invited a Wellington delegation to South Africa. Barbara England and Eloise Chevrier made the journey. Then in 1994, in the weeks leading up to Nelson Mandela's historic election, Elaine Clemen visited South Africa as well.
We were in a tiny, tiny village, and we did have ballots. And an elderly woman came up to me, and she took the ballot, and she took her finger, and went down like this. And Mandela's picture was about 3/4 the way down. She finished, and she said, "Now I can die in peace, because I am considered a full human being."
When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the United States imposed devastating economic sanctions on the Iraqi people. President George H.W. Bush deployed U.S. forces to the region, as did over 30 other nations. In January of 1991, the United States invaded Iraq in the first Gulf War.
I remember coming back from Iraq in 1991. By the time I came back, really, people had forgotten about that war. And I realized a lot of people, they had other things to think about and worry about and care about. What I really appreciated about Wellington is that people honestly did care. They cared about people in war zones in places like Iraq and cared deeply. Their hearts were so open. So Wellington had a tremendous capacity for collective care about people that they might never personally meet, whom they would hold up in their prayer, in their rhythms of liturgy, in their identification of what it meant to try to be disciples and to follow Jesus.
The first Gulf War lasted only a month, but cost over $60 billion, hundreds of American military lives, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. Wellington organized to offer relief from the destructive effects of the economic sanctions by sending infant care kits to the people of Iraq. As with the Vietnam War, the church sent a delegation to a Washington, D.C. March for Peace. Wellington also sent members to protest an atrocity much closer to home.
Fort Benning housed the infamous School of the Americas, which is a U.S. supported, sponsored, funded school that trained Latin American soldiers, the same kind of soldiers that threatened the families that we took into sanctuary.
We are longtime members with the School of the Americas Watch, which has a 30-year history of gathering in Fort Benning, where the School of the Americas is located. And so Wellington people would gather at Fort Benning.
Chris and Sarah had organized a group of kids to sing on stage, and my daughter was one of those kids. And I remember she gave a pretty powerful little testimony, having come from Chiapas, Mexico.
For decades, Wellington commissioned groups of congregants to protest at the gates of Fort Benning, Georgia, many of whom were arrested carrying out nonviolent acts of civil disobedience.
It's not common to find another congregation that has that mística, we would say in Spanish, that sense of a central aspect of its faith being justice.
Wellington spread its concern for human rights elsewhere, from across the street to across the world. Refugees from Kosovo and Afghanistan were sent care kits, and members lobbied legislators in Springfield for universal health care. Work continued against police brutality and the death penalty. Timeline Theater moved into Baird Hall, beginning a decades-long relationship with Wellington and cementing the church's support of the arts. Wellington strengthened its resolve to support LGBTQ rights. The church continued to participate in the Chicago Pride Parade, dedicated a Gay Pride Sunday, donated to the Matthew Shepard Memorial Fund and AIDS education programs, and sponsored an LGBTQ film festival. Wellington office space was given to the Pink Angels, a citizen-led movement dedicated to stopping crime against the LGBTQ community. As the church approached its 100th year and the 20th century drew to a close, Wellington's commitment to faith in action was as vibrant as ever. Soon that commitment would be tested as a new age of war and terror dawned. In response to the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States launched a global war on terror, and for the second time in as many decades, invaded Iraq. Once again, billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives were wasted.
Every family that has to bury a loved one, it's a very private ceremony. You have your family, your friends, and that's it. And the private grief really leads to very personal questions, like why my son or daughter, why my husband or wife. But this is a public memorial that allows all of us to have some sense of public grief and mourning. And the public grief leads to political questions. Why this war?
As with the war in Vietnam, Reverend Michael McConnell used his Wellington tentmaker role to continue his witness for peace as the Midwest Regional Director of the American Friends Service Committee.
We knew there was so much that the public did not know. And so we kept living with it. How do we show the American public the human cost of this war? I remember in Washington, May of 2004, and there was a woman that came up, a young woman who had lost her uncle, who was also her godfather. And we looked all over for her boots, and she just sat down by these pair of boots and wept. And it was like, all of a sudden it hit me. I mean, this is a way for people to show their grief.
Wellington undertook an active peace campaign in opposition to the Iraq War. Kathy Kelly returned to Wellington and spoke about her experience in Iraq, while congregants marched, held vigils, and participated in civil disobedience.
Being in an anti-war march and seeing Michael McConnell, who had organized it, and also seeing, I think, Chris and Sarah and maybe the Wellington Choir singing, at this rally, it made me proud.
As always, the women of Wellington were at the forefront, with a small group forming what became known as the Raging Grannies.
We stood on that bridge over the outer drive. It was colder than cold. The policemen, of course, they didn't know what they were taking on, these older women, and they told us that we couldn't be doing this on private property. And we said, oh, it's not private property. We went to many, many other locations.
Wellington also joined the American Friends Service Committee's Campaign for Conscience by providing aid to the Iraqi people in violation of U.S. law, committing to debt cancellation for third world countries in the Jubilee 2000 movement, supporting refugees from Afghanistan and Angola, giving housing to Colombian human rights workers, all the while working with the night ministry and cooking for homeless shelters. Wellington also took a leadership role in advocating for health care justice, as Reverend Chevrier preached in the early 2000s. While Christians don't have to take a position on every issue, on matters of justice, they have no choice. The central meaning of the gospel is, true faith always implies action. Faith without action is no faith at all. The beginning of the century also saw the end of an era. After 33 years of transformative leadership, Wellington said goodbye to David and Eloise Chevrier.
I remember I played a lot of Bach, and I can't not play Bach anytime today and not think of David.
It was at his retirement. I can see his face and see his whole body when he would listen to music. His eyes were closed and he would sort of lift his head a little and he would rock. And you could tell that no matter what it was just moving through him.
David Chevrier preaching about Lazarus after his heart attack, and no one believed that he was going to make it back as the person that he was. And it was an astonishing sermon, and just such a great moment.
So David was a great preacher, a great mentor, a great friend.
He just spoke to my heart when I came in here. That's why I joined this church.
You know, when I started at Wellington, David was just about winding down. And for me, this is what the gospel is all about. This is what Christ really intended for us to be our brother's keeper, right? To pay attention to the marginalized, to welcome all people, to love your neighbor as yourself.
Now go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honor all people. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit.
After the departure of David and Eloise Chevrier, the church inaugurated the first of many Elizabeth Betty Benson Awards, which recognized individuals and organizations for their faith in action. For her tireless activism towards abolition of capital punishment and ministering to those on death row, Betty was given the first award.
What a special lady she was. I just kept remembering her ministry to pray for folks on death row every Sunday. That was just a special gift that we had in Betty.
There's so many things I remember about Betty, my friend, someone I truly admired, just full of love for everybody else, and she cared about you, you knew, okay? And she would go to no ends to assist you. Can't help but love somebody like that.
I certainly don't pray to saints or think much about saints, but if there are saints, Betty is one.
In later years, the award was given to people and groups that worked against war and advocated for human rights, environmental justice, economic justice, victims of police brutality, and the rights of indigenous people. Continuing Wellington's tradition of prophetic witness proved to be a challenge. After a series of interim pastors that were not a good fit with Wellington, in 2007, Reverend Dan Dale was called as its pastor and was joined by his wife, Nancy Jones.
He was a mighty force on demonstrating for immigration, anti-war. And he was a big man like David had been. And he'd throw his arms out, and he could never be confined by the pulpit.
Reverend Dale's commitment to asylum seekers and his passionate dedication to community organizing strengthened Wellington's mission for nearly a decade. Meanwhile, the church's building was showing its age and its limits. As open as the congregation was to the community, the sanctuary was not accessible. A congregant had an idea to raise funds.
My whole family's in circus. And I was like, why don't we do a fundraiser to raise money for accessibility for the church? Then we did it that year.
To see the joy in the children's faces, I was moved almost to tears of how much fun the little children were having in our place of worship.
My grandson, he just loved it. We loved it. I thought it was magical.
There was nothing from my past church experience that linked with what I was seeing at Wellington. The people seemed to have a different definition of what it was to be religious, what it was to go to church.
I don't know, it's like a ministry of fun, really. It's not a political thing, but it is something that brought people from Lakeview and brought people from all over.
Nino's Circus became a holiday tradition at Wellington and was performed for 8 years in a row.
It was family, it was warm, it was close. And I believe we worked 8 years, and then finally we got the church was accessible to everybody.
As the sanctuary entered its final decade of service, Wellington continued its advocacy for the environment, held vigils against mass incarceration, and found a new way to champion immigrant and refugee rights.
Stand up, courageous love, speak up, courageous love, rise up, courageous love, don't give up, courageous love.
12 years ago, we began co-sponsoring El Pueblo Canta, which means the people sing. That's part of our ministry, bringing people together through El Pueblo Canta to celebrate the beauty and power and compassion of those people working in support of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers.
In 2008, Wellington hosted what would become an annual celebration, El Pueblo Canta.
It's been really cool that my church gets to host this musical event, an international event, to raise awareness and funding for immigration-related programming in the city. It's just this cool collision of, again, those powerhouses of the church, the inter-agency, inter-community type work, as well as music. It's like, what's better than that?
7 years ago, we started a program called Eco Arts, and we have had each year 25 to 30 children, 3 years to 13 years old, who would come to Wellington, and art and music and drama. Because of that work, we were able to be beyond the walls of our church.
Stand up, courageous love, speak up, courageous love.
In 2014, the National Immigrant Justice Center, an organization founded by Reverend Craig Mooson in the 1970s, came to Wellington asking for help supporting 2 refugee families seeking asylum. Wellington again said yes and voted to join a larger group of sponsors that assisted them in gaining asylum. Environmental justice had been a critical part of Wellington's mission, dating back to the 1920s and the Black Skies campaign. As the pace of climate change threatened more and more communities around the globe, Wellington committed even more deeply to this work.
We began to talk about what we could do at Wellington to lower its footprint as a physical structure.
Conscientious Projector was the idea was to show a social justice, environmentally relevant film on a regular basis. If we could, and many times we did, we brought in the producer of the film and afterwards had a discussion.
We had a whole committee that we formed on looking at ways to what we were calling green the church. And out of that came the decision to install solar panels.
Wellington appealed to me because of its dedication to community. Not only the scriptures, but living out the scriptures.
Putting in solar panels went far beyond the financial benefits. It was more about what does it do to the environment? What is our responsibility to our brothers and sisters that are going to come in the future, let alone the ones that are here today?
When Wellington member Polly Ulrich died in a car accident, her husband David ensured her memory would live on in the mission of Wellington.
I also remember with very bittersweet memories. I'll have trouble with this. Polly's memorial service. The church was full and full of good spirit. And right in the middle of the service, the sun shone down through the skylights. Yeah, it was a little direct intervention. One of the things that I wanted to do after Polly died was to do something at Wellington that would keep her spirit alive.
Wellington dedicated the Art for Joy program in Polly's honor. Classes were made available to children and adults in the congregation and the neighborhood, and were taught by Ashley Clark and Mark Burge Anderson.
We had many wonderful sessions there, and I know there are probably young people whose lives have been changed forever because they were at the Polly Elric Art for Joy program.
In 2011, Wellington sadly said goodbye to another beloved leader. After receiving a challenging health diagnosis, Reverend Dale retired.
Wellington has been an important part of my life since 1982. It was very hard to leave.
When we lost these men, Dan retired. It was such a hole in our community, I think.
What really gave me a depth of feeling and commitment to Wellington was Pastor Dan and his preaching and his connecting of social justice issues to the gospel.
After the departure of Reverend Dale, the congregation voted to arrange with a larger group of churches sanctuary for more families. The building also remained a haven for those in need. When several heads of state met at the NATO summit in Chicago in 2012, thousands of protesters marched against the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Once again, Wellington offered sanctuary to those fighting for justice.
When Michael McConnell decided that the American Men's Service Committee had volunteered to offer hospitality when all the protesters were coming for Occupy NATO, his office space soon was overcrowded, so they volunteered Wellington. Thursday night, we had hundreds of people from all over the country congregating at Wellington. We had to serve food through the street basement windows and put a soup kitchen on the sidewalk.
The emphasis, of course, was on outreach. And the building was there for our use, but it was not a priority. It was really a patch here, patch there, we'll put that off. We'll give money away to help this organization, and then we'll fix the roof later.
After the departure of Reverend Dale, the church again entered a challenging time searching for leadership. Several pastors came and went without finding a good match for this truly maverick congregation. The times were troubled. Political divisions in the country worsened. Racism was on the rise, and the climate crisis loomed. As the building aged and more time, energy, and money was needed for its upkeep, the congregation began to ask if it was time to leave this old house.
It is an incredibly brave and faithful move for the people of Wellington to say, you know, this old house was a great house for a season in our lives, and it's not the house for us anymore.
In June 2020, after deciding to sell the building and leave their home of 110 years, and during the height of a global pandemic, the church called as pastor Anne Louise Hawk, who was joined by her partner, Dr. Shelby Hatch.
Nowhere in the gospel anywhere does Jesus say, and the kingdom of heaven is like a beautiful church building.
I feel like there's a certain sense of excitement as we go out into the world and really living into what the people that Jesus has called us to be.
Wellington has become a church without walls, and we're exploring what exactly and what path we want to take. It has been absolutely exciting because the sky is the limit.
And now that we're leaving and we're re-identifying ourselves in some way, what's our role as Christians? Why be a Christian?
Since its beginning, since before its beginning, this community has been so clear about its call. Not only to be that prophetic voice that urges people to live out the gospel in ways big and small in their lives, not just to call people to do that, but to actually live it out together as a community.
And perhaps the next invitation is go out in the wilderness, as we say in our benediction, as we say at our communion table, that God is with us when we walk that walk into the wilderness.
So we will find wonderful and unique adventures as we explore the path God is now opening to us, and we will do it with our hearts wide open. And my friends, as our Wellington song says, we give thanks for the unknown blessings already on their way. We give thanks. Amen.
What a grand adventure we could have.
Won't you let me be your servant? Let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I may have the grace to let you be my servant too. We are pilgrims on a journey. We are travelers on the road. We are here to help each other go the mile and bear the load. I will hold the Christ light for you in the shadow of your fear. I will hold my hand out to you, seek the peace you long to hear. I will weep when you are weeping, when you laugh, I'll laugh with you. I will share your joy and sorrow till we've seen this journey through. When we sing to God in heaven, we shall find such harmony. Born of all we grow together, of Christ's love and agony. Won't you let me be your servant? Let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I may have the grace to let you be my servant.